bold letters for me. That should now be recording. So, yeah, a very welcome to everyone. This is the Getting Started in Quantitative Research in Clinical Education Research webinar. If you've come to the wrong place, then now is the time to disappear off. It's part of the Clinical Incubator in Clinical Education Research, which was set up by the NHR basically to encourage more clinicians to get involved in educational research. We have various things going on. None of us are kind of employed by the NHR. We are simply clinical educators who like doing a bit of research and like to try and encourage others to do so as well. And there's different levels. This is, by definition, the Getting Started series. So this is basics for those of you who've not done any or done a little bit. If you're more experienced, great. It'd be great to hear from you and hear your views, etc. as well. But just to say that if you look on the website, and at the end of the session, I'll put up the website, but most people will probably have had it at some point because that's how you registered. But if you search for Incubator for Clinical Education Research, it'll come up. But there are some Mastering the Basics level for kind of medium experienced, mid-experienced researchers. And there's also sessions for supervisors as well. So there hopefully is something for everyone. My name is Hugh Alberti, as you can probably see from the Teams box. I am Professor General Practice Education at Newcastle University. So I'm a half-time clinician, half-time educator and researcher. And I'll let Robbie introduce himself shortly. We haven't got time to go around everyone as to who they are and what they do, but it'd be fabulous to know. Maybe I'm just nosy, but if you're happy to use the chat box, just introduce yourself. So who you are, where you work, what you do, because folk have found, oh, look, there's someone down the corridor who's also at this session, and get into collaborations and discussions. So it'd be great to hear from you. As I said at the beginning, Robbie's going to talk for half an hour or so with some slides, which will be available on the website, and the recording, because I remembered to press start, will also be ready on the website. So you'll have access to those afterwards. What else am I being? Oh, I've been told to say that if anyone needs a certificate, then they can email the incubator, and again, I'll put up the email address at the end. But you can email us, and we're happy to send you a certificate. And equally, we won't make you fill in any feedback because it is the third year now. I think we're running this series. But if you do have any feedback, we'd love to hear it, and that'll be the same email address. Feel free to, well, do keep yourself on mute whilst Robbie's talking. And then, as I said, at the end, there'll be a chance for a question and answer session, and then we'll encourage you to put your video on and unmute yourself to ask a question. But also feel free to pop questions up in the chat box during the talk, and then we'll make sure we cover those as well. I think that is everything that I've got to say. So definitely enough talking for me. So I'll now pass you over to Robbie. Great to have you with us, Robbie, again. And do introduce yourself first.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, and thanks for having me back. So I suppose I'm Robbie, one of the F3s up in Newcastle, and currently I'm doing a genomics fellow year. But I was going to try and talk today a little bit about some of my experience and my interests of getting involved initially as a medical student in quantitative educational research, and how that has married quite nicely within my work with kind of qualitative work, and then also try and give some examples of where, it can kind of start and not necessarily be small scale, but be relatively descriptive, and then move into some more kind of weird, wonderful and fancy stuff that is applicable and can help us make decisions around workforce and important data around how we do our or how we plan our NHS in the future. Just more checking, that looks like some slides that hopefully people can see. Yeah, good. I'm seeing a thumbs up. So there we go. So yeah, as I've said, I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, a bit about my background in cancer genomics, but then also in educational research. A bit around, I suppose, getting started and think a little bit about what is quantitative research and how it's helpful, and then how that interfaces with other types of research in medical education. And then a bit about methods and what methods are out there on gathering it and how it can be analysed. And I'll touch very briefly on what software I use and then what software is out there for educational research. And then a couple of examples of two projects from me, and then have hopefully an opportunity to do some Q&A to talk about, I suppose, the more general aspects of quantitative research and anything else that anyone has any questions on. This isn't going to be a deep dive in statistical methodology or the maths, and I will touch on some methods in quant, but I've tried to reduce any level of maths that we have in here, partly because some of them I don't understand, but also because it's very applied and not helpful, I think, in a session like this, but very open to discuss afterwards, and people please feel free to email me if that's useful. And this is also a very selective description of what types of quantitative research are out there in education, and certainly there are thousands of methods and lots of methodologies out there that you could use in this space that I'm not going to talk about. So it is a very broad church that I'll be touching on today. So I suppose my main academic interests, as currently an academic, predominantly F3 as a research fellow, who will be moving into an academic clinical fellowship, is firstly around medical education research. And the thing I find most interesting is what makes people choose certain careers, and can we predict why someone will go into a career, for example, a GP versus a psychiatrist versus an oncologist, etc., etc. And if there are determining factors that alter that, say, for example, background prior to university, your university exposure, and after that, what makes people go where? And then within that, I suppose, try to answer some of my own questions within who choose to do academic careers and who choose to do research on research careers within the NHS. More broadly, and I suppose my main clinical interest is in cancer and cancer research, and my role this year is trying to implement bits of cancer genomics within the NHS, particularly within circulating tumour DNA, but then also have some funding from Cancer Research UK to do work on long read sequencing and sort of novel technologies that may become applicable in the NHS and help us diagnose cancer better effectively. And actually those two jobs actually overlap quite nicely, because the skills that I use in kind of bioinformatics land are actually quite similar to the same sort of data analytical skills I would use in medical education research. So very simply, to start off with, what is quantitative research? And it's the idea of collecting, analysing data, which can be numerical, that you can measure, describe, and use that to explain a pattern or relationship within a population, or at least that's what UKRI tell us. And very simply, it's can I put a number on it? And does that help me measure the thing I'm trying to measure? There we go. It's, I suppose, what we'd say inductive or deductive, sorry, where you come to the data with a hypothesis saying, I want to test this, and your methodologies will test that within the data set you have. And that means it can tell you sort of broad associations of what is happening, but it is very limited to say why something is happening. So quantitative research will let you describe something, but it won't. But then you have to, I suppose, infer what that means in your setting. And certainly, some of the outputs you get from quantitative research aren't necessarily informative if you don't have the context where the data was gathered or what all the data means. And that means that all good quantitative research should have underpinning and a backing from quantitative literature, whether or not that's in the same project or from a broader base, but all good quantitative research should draw from somewhere within qualitative literature, which can try to explain or attempt to explain why you observe a phenomenon in quantitative work. I'll talk a little bit about where this data comes from. So this can be survey-based, and I think that's probably the most common source in educational research that's out there. Relatively low resource, so making a good survey is not simple. And they can be relatively flexible, and you can draw several inferences sometimes from the same question. You can also supplement your survey with a bit of qualitative data to say, sort of to help you try and start to answer that question of, I see this, why is that happening? But often the data you'll gather from a qualitative free text perspective is also quite descriptive, but that can allow you to then build your questions and build your thoughts to then move that into more advanced structured qualitative work. in future. So I think surveys are probably the most common, and I think certainly that's how I got started in kind of quantitative research in medical education. I suppose the next step up from that are things like big observational data sets, which can sometimes be population level. So that's where we're tracking a group of people over time. And that can be from kind of, your own, some say a medical school or a deanery, where you can look at how people do at assessments and what that means later on for them. Or say, for example, admissions data and looking at who has applied to medical school, who is applying to a post, and who actually gets into that post. But then there are much broader data sets available out there, which I'll touch on in shortly, held by things like the Medical School Council, the UK Medical Education Database, or UK Med, which I'll talk about later, and then also the GMC, that allow us to really think much more broadly around what does our workforce look like, and who goes where within our workforce. And certainly the resources that we have in the UK are probably the most powerful resource in the world for answering questions like that. In terms of analysis software, there are loads out there. I've given, 6, but there are, you come across new ones every couple of days. Predominantly, I use R, which is a coding language with also something you can use as a graphical user interface, or GUI, which is what that means in all the other ones, something called RStudio. For people establishing quantitative research and if you're doing something complicated, R is definitely the best. But pretty much everything you can ever do in any of these software packages, it is possible in Excel. It's not easy, but it is possible. And certainly for simple descriptive stuff, say, for example, survey data, I would recommend everyone just uses something similar to Excel, because that is sort of very simple. You can really see your data and you can see what you're doing with it. And again, you can get very complicated with Excel very quickly. I think, for example, I saw online the other day that someone had managed to publish a paper with UK Med data where they did the entire statistics, which included things like Markov chain models and rather complicated stats. They did the whole thing in Excel. I wouldn't recommend that approach because that feels traumatic, but it is possible to do that sort of thing. Then there's also things like SPSS and Stata, which certainly at Newcastle, they're available for our university and actually for our NHS trust. But they can also be really helpful for sort of an early introduction into specific statistical software, and then other tools available as well. The thing I would say, as we're moving into the age of AI overlords and Elon Musk, is that for most of these analysis software, there's lots of documentation online, and there's lots of people have done pretty much everything that you can think of, mostly in terms of analysis techniques for all of these software packages. So ChatGPT and similar are your friends. Other AI models available. But certainly for getting started in sort of this sort of kind of coding, or how do I do something in Excel, things like these large language models often know exactly what you need to do. Well, know is a strong word there, I guess, but they can help you get started in that and help you understand how to analyze your data. So ChatGPT and similar are your friends when you are looking at data. Don't give any clinical data, don't do anything like that. But certainly if you want to know how to do something, this can be a lot easier than spending 6 to 10 hours trying to scroll through Stack Overflows, which I have certainly done before. So now I want to kind of touch on a couple of examples of quantitative research that we've done up in Newcastle, just to kind of touch on, I suppose, some examples of where that's helpful. And this was a study that we did in Newcastle where actually as a medical student, I think it was in my 2nd or 3rd year of medical school, I kind of thought that actually the teaching we have on research and how to get into sort of clinical academic careers isn't great. And I've been very lucky to have some very productive conversations with much more senior people than me at the medical, for example, Professor Vance and Paul Pace, who's now head of school, to talk about, well, actually, shall we have a look at this, and shall we have a think how we can improve our teaching, and then also have a think about why people do and don't want to do these sort of research careers from medical school. And the way we structured this was we had kind of an exploratory survey where we started off collecting data from 188 students, and we wanted to ask why they wanted, or what they thought about research and what they thought about research teaching, and then what they saw as the kind of barriers and enablers to getting involved in research as students, for example, through intercalation, student projects, things like that. and then also what would make them want to do an academic or research career and start to think about going towards that. We then expanded that survey and that's slightly more refined questions based on the data that we gathered in phase one to get a better idea of what the barriers were and how important each barrier was. And again, that was completely quantitative of how we understood that. And then finally, after that, we used semi-structured interviews to understand people have spoken about these barriers, people have rated these barriers and enablers important, but let's try and get an idea of actually why they're important and what underpins each of those barriers. And we found some fairly interesting things to explain the barriers and enablers that we found in the initial surveys. I suppose very briefly, and just to present some data, the initial barriers that we found were things like were actually pretty much all themed around people didn't really know what was out there. So people would often cite, and this is data from the phase two survey, that the strongest barrier or the most significant barrier were lack of advertised opportunities, i.e. students felt they didn't know or they felt that the institution wasn't promoting these sorts of opportunities. A lot of students also felt that lack of prior research experience was a problem. And they felt that meant that not having experience meant they couldn't get involved in research. But obviously that's a bit difficult of how you jump on the wheel if you don't have any experience. How can you get some experience? And certainly, now as being fortunate to supervise students, I would expect that none of my students have any experience in research at all. And I think that is a common expectation. But that seems to have not necessarily gotten through in our sets with our students. And I think that is a very important consideration, that when we are advertising opportunities, which we still need to do, how do we make that open? How do we make that how do we make sure that they understand that this is a base level? This is so we can help train you to then go on to do better work. And then also lack of confidence in their own abilities. And that's a really interesting one that we were able to expand upon a lot more within the main paper and the references on the slide. When we interviewed the participants, because lack of confidence can mean a lot of things, and lack of confidence certainly we found was surrounded by both things like personal factors, but then also things like social group factors. For example, my friends don't do research, therefore why should I do research? And if my friends aren't competent in research, why should I be competent to do research? And that's, I suppose, kind of a nice example of where you can pull out these sort of very descriptive individual things which we know are there in the population, but we don't know what they mean. And that's where the interviews in this study came in to say, actually, what does that mean? If that's helpful. So that, I suppose, is, although took quite a lot of time to get sorted, is conceptually quite a simple project and relatively simple to understand from a kind of, we surveyed some people and we interviewed some people to ask them what they said in the survey. The next project we used something called the UK Med, or the UK Medical Education Database, to understand sort of to kind of get a proper big observational data set to understand who enters clinical academic careers and who applies to them and then who actually enters them. And the stage that we wanted to look at was kind of the early clinical academic career pipeline. So things like who intercalates, who enters the SFP, and who enters the academic clinical fellowships. And this is an example of the rough map of the early clinical academic career pipeline, where I'm about here, sort of treading in between the two of these bits, but where you have some opportunities early in medical school, like intercalated degrees, the academic now specialised foundation programme, which of course has now gone under quite broad changes in how it's selected, and then also academic clinical fellowships. And we kind of focused on this early bit here to understand what makes people go from 1 to 2 to 3. The reason that this is important more broadly is that certainly the House of Lords and then also a number of other groups have cited that, firstly, our clinical academic workforce is not reflective of the population that the clinicians treat, and is predominantly a male-dominated field, and also has a number of ethnic biases within the population, but then also the numbers of clinical academic work, or numbers in the clinical academic workforce are dropping year on year, and in kind of the middle reader to senior lecturer level group. And certainly we've seen that across pretty much every specialty in the country for the last decade or so. And that is concerning. And how we progress research is through, or how we progress healthcare and how we progress our NHS workforce is through research. So we need to have that workforce, and we need to make sure people know that is an option for them, and that we have those pipelines in place for those people to get to those sorts of more senior stages. At the moment, there's very little work that describes who intercalates, who applies for the SFP, and then goes on to do further academic training like the ACF. And there is no work at all that describes sort of once someone's applied, who actually gets in. Um, and what we wanted to do is try and link those steps together to say, well, if you do one, how likely are you to do the next, and after that. And the way we approached this was by thinking about what could be the groups of predictors that predict if someone goes into doing a research or an early clinical academic opportunity. And the way we approached this was looking at people's educational backgrounds prior to medical school. So, say, for example, the school you went to prior to entering university, um, uh, and if you went to a private school, people's protected characteristics, so things like gender, ethnicity, and disability status, and then also socioeconomic background as well. And the things and our main outcomes in this, we had 5 main outcomes, were if someone intercalates, if someone applied to the SFP, and then if they applied, did they get in? And then again for the ACF. So if they applied to an ACF, did they get in? To do that, we use the UK Medical Education Database, or the UK Med, which is the most powerful tool of its type in the world. And we were able to capture basically everyone who went through medical school from about 2010 to 2018, so that's about 43,000 people, to ask the question of, and then everyone who entered the foundation programme between 2014 and 2022, to look at our first cohort, which was who intercalates and who enters the SFP. And then following that, we wanted to ask the question of who enters further academic training. So we took everyone across these 4 years from 2018 to 2022, so about 20,000 people, to ask, if you have finished foundation, how likely are you to go into an academic career or clinical academic post after that? And then these were the 5 models that we put together to kind of try and link this together as a pipeline. I suppose just to kind of briefly talk about UK Med quickly, this is roughly the data that we had in our sets and where the data came from. The thing that's great about the UK Med, and I would seriously recommend anyone who has kind of a big question around workforce and around how the workforce in the NHS or the medical workforce in the NHS works, seriously think about using UK Med data, because it is the only data set that draws from places like UCAS, the UK Foundation Programme, Oriel, every single rural college in the country, and the Medical Schools Council to really give you the most in-depth data possible on basically everyone who has ever gone through medical school in the UK, pretty much. And means that we can draw really rich data sets for every single model that we wanted to do to try and answer all of our questions. I'm going to touch on a little bit about the data analysis we used and the approaches we used. So we used something called a mixed effects logistic regression model for the 5 models. So, and basically that was asking, so logistic regression is saying kind of a binary outcome, and our outcome here was, did you go into the SFP or did you not go into the SFP? We controlled for medical school and we controlled for the year of application through random effects. And then we also use something called multiple imputation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that for handling missing data. So the first thing around mixed effects modeling and random modeling to talk about is that we know, so for our question that we were asking is who enters clinical academic opportunities and who applies for them. We know, for example, that different universities and different medical schools certainly have different proportions of people who enter the SFP. So say, for example, those who go to Oxford or Cambridge have a much higher rate of applying to or entering the specialised foundation programme than those who went to my institution or other institutions across the country. But the most important thing is that this is not an analysis of curriculum, and we know that there are curriculum biases. We're wanting to try and highlight why or what other factors apart from curriculum draw people to and from these sorts of careers. So the way we did that is we used a mixed effects model, which effectively breaks these out individually and asks the question, okay, why do people at Oxford apply? Okay, then why do people at Cambridge apply, etc., etc., etc. And then draw with the variables that we've put into it, and then pulls those models together to try and answer the question of why do people apply without having to think, without drawing much thought towards which university they went to. So we know that's a factor, but that's not the factor that we want to answer in this model. The next thing I want to talk about is handling of missing data. Missing data is inevitable in sets like this, and certainly you will see missing data in things like surveys, and that because it just happens and it is unavoidable. But for big sets like this, missing data actually is very common within the data sets that we're trying to play with, and we see a lot of missing data. So within all the variables that we've included in our modeling, nearly half of the data is missing, or over half the data is missing in certain variables. The biggest problem with that is if we can't run any of the people in the models with any missing data. So we only ran the data with about 40% in our models. That's a massive problem and introduces huge biases, because we know that the data is not missing completely at random. So we know that people from certain universities, say, just don't have that line of data in our set. And that means that we would exclude everyone from that university or everyone from that particular background. And that's a massive problem within our sets. So the way that we adjusted for that is using something called multiple imputation. And basically how that works is we used a package called Amelia, which is a very good R package to do it, where effectively you get the computer to predict, based on every other source of data, what the missing bit of data is for that row. You do that, we did it about 40 times. So we get the computer to make different guesses about 40 times, then run the analysis, and then pool everything back together to get a very sensible average of what it would be if the data was present. This, as an approach, is robust. It makes your data better. And if you have problems with your sets with missing data, and you're not missing loads of data, you're kind of missing scattered bits here, there, and everywhere. Actually, this can be a really robust way to handle that. I mean, that you can get really nice models out the end. And even things like large survey work, certainly I've used imputation before in that, and it's worth thinking about that. Just because you have some missing data, it doesn't mean you have to bin half your data set to actually complete the analysis. It's worth thinking about. So results wise, let's talk a little bit about who intercalates. So what we found in this set is, or what we did here was we took the people who didn't have compulsory intercalation. So people who went to medical school with an option to intercalate. I know intercalation is not an option for everyone, particularly around funding constraints, which is worth thinking about, but we've used the term optional. And we see that we had a cohort of about 27,000 people to ask who does and doesn't intercalate. And what we found is that people who scored highest in their degree, so EPM, so education performance measure, back when that was used, were more likely to intercalate. But then also there were some interesting factors around who don't intercalate. Say, for example, if you went to a state-funded school, you're less likely to intercalate than from a privately funded school. Similarly, if you are from a more socioeconomically deprived background, you are less likely to intercalate. And those who are disabled are also less likely to intercalate. And unfortunately, the theme that we see throughout all of our data is women were significantly less likely to intercalate than men. Moving on to who actually applies to the SFP. So we see about a quarter-ish of people end up applying to the SFP, so about 9,000 out of 40,000. And then following that, about 3,000 of those actually entered an SFP post during the time that we had during the time that we studied. Firstly, think about educational background. So what we found was the strongest predictor of if you were going to apply to the SFP was if you had either a prior degree or had intercalated. And those that had done an intercalated degree were about 6 times more likely to apply to the SFP than those who hadn't. What we also found is that if people had applied, intercalation was still important, and you were about twice as likely to get an SFP post than if you hadn't intercalated. We also found that people from state-funded schools were less likely to apply to the SFP, but if they had applied, were not significantly less likely to get the post. Thinking about protected characteristics now, again, I think something that's worth highlighting is that women were significantly less likely to apply to the SFP, but if they had applied, they had about the same odds of getting the post compared to men if they had applied. And moving on to socioeconomic data, again, people from more deprived backgrounds by IMD at least were less likely to apply to the SFP, but were not less likely to get the post if they had applied. Okay, and then thinking a little bit about who goes on to pursue further academic training and sort of thing post like the ACF. So what we see is that about 8% of all people who finish the foundation programme end up applying to an academic training post. About half of these come from people who've done an SFP. And what we certainly see within our data is that the strongest predictor by far of if you had applied to an ACF was if you had done an SFP. And those who had done an SFP were about 13 times more likely to apply to the ACF than those who didn't ever apply for an SFP in the first place. So certainly, I think this highlights that, and similarly with intercalated degrees, this highlights that if you have done early stuff, it means you're a lot more likely to do later stuff. Again, importantly, what we also see is that women were significantly less likely than men to apply to the academic clinical fellowships and further academic training. But importantly, and I think it is worth noting this, that if women had applied, they did not have significantly lower odds of getting into the programme. So at least with our data, the selection doesn't appear to be biasing certain groups, but people who are applying to these posts are not representative of the wider workforce. And again, the strongest predictor of if you were going to get an academic clinical training or an ACF was if you had completed an SFP. So again, prior experiences build into your, I suppose, ability and then competitiveness of actually getting these posts, because they are certainly competitive. So again, our key findings, this is the first studies profile who actually goes into these opportunities by sample size. It's also the largest study that's looked at these early career opportunities and links together these opportunities of intercalation, SFP, and further academic training like the ACF into kind of a notional early career academic pipeline. And then highlights the importance of having those early experiences and things like intercalation because of the impact they have later on down the line. But then I think also demonstrates significant inequities and inequalities within our current workforce and current early career academic pipeline. And something I think is concerning is that women are underrepresented at every single stage at the point of application that we've looked at. And again, it's sort of harking back to what I was saying at the start, this quantitative study doesn't tell us why people or certain groups of people aren't entering these opportunities or aren't entering early career academic opportunities. And this should be hopefully followed up by some more robust qualitative work that can start to ask those questions of, we see this happening in the population, why is it happening? And then it also raises a number of further questions of how can we support students and resident doctors getting these opportunities in future. Funding is very important. There's also some points about research culture that need to be thought about, i.e. do people think of themselves as researchers? And is that something we can challenge? And is that something we can change? And then also signposting opportunities, harking back to the study I spoke about earlier. I think it's probably fair to say a lot of people just don't know these opportunities exist, which is why we have talks like this one that can let us think about what's out there, think about how we can approach it, and then actually do some good work. And again, thinking about from at least what the literature tells us at the moment about why some groups are less likely to pursue research. Most of the literature that's out there discusses at the postgraduate, relatively senior levels, and certainly there's some amazing work by Gabs Finn in Manchester to describe these points. But actually, at kind of the early stages, there's relatively little work to describe what happens at the undergraduate level, and certainly is an area to think about in future, for future work. And that's everything we'll talk about. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions, and we can hopefully have a quick Q&A to talk about some of the stuff and how you can get involved in some quant work as well. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. Thank you very much indeed, Robbie. I hope that was helpful. I guess it's one of those where we're not going to go through loads of statistics tests because that's what you get from a statistician. But I think the examples of how you can use it, and particularly I really like the idea of how it then complements qualitative research, which I'm guessing many of us people on the chat box have said that they're a bit more experienced in the qualitative. So how they complement each other, I think, was really, really helpful. I guess my little two top tips, and then we'll open up for questions. One is, I suppose, it's similar to qualitative research, is always thinking before you ask a load of questions in some surveys, which is probably the most likely methodology you'd be using, or other means, then just think about the stats beforehand. I think you'd agree with that, Robbie. And And normally I would say make sure you speak to a statistician. I think Robbie's suggesting make sure you chat to AI first. And if not, then find a statistician. But just make sure that you know what you're doing, what stats you're going to be using before you go ahead. Because actually so often you can ask a load of questions, surveys, can't you? And then just think, actually, this wasn't particularly needed, and that's a waste of a question in the end. So yeah, so make sure you, and don't be scared of quantitative research. That'll be fair enough as well, Robbie, would it? And when it's the right methodology to answer the question, then it's really useful. And even if we don't use it as often in education research, it definitely has a place.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Yeah. So yeah, anything to add to that, Robbie, for top tips?
I think I'll just hark on the kind of, if you put bad data in, you're going to get bad outputs. So absolutely putting together things like surveys and things like that, it takes time, it takes thought, and most importantly, I think talking to whoever you're gathering the data from, to make sure that the data that you're gathering actually makes sense. And certainly like the work that I'm currently doing in lung cancer, for example, the questions that I've put into interviews and surveys for patients are read completely wrong by a number of patients, and that's a massive problem, and means that I need to go back and do some more work with patients to work out actually what am I asking here, and do people understand that? And certainly it's exactly the same in education work, and people will not understand the questions the same way as you do. So understanding your audience is important to make sure you have the right data to put into a fancy test.
Fabulous. So yeah, we'll open up for questions. Do pop your hand up electronically, and then if you're in a place and a location where you can put your video on and ask the question yourself, that would be ideal. If you're not, then do feel free to pop a question up in the chat box. But open to questions. Yes, hi, Aileen. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone, and Robbie, huge thanks. That is such an important study. It's such a fabulous example of using data to drive what I would think is to drive improvement. And I think what you're trying to get to is identifying where potentially the problem is, which you've really clearly articulated, which is really big news to me, about the underrepresentation at these different levels. Whereas actually, as you say, if we were to just look at one particular cohort of, SFPs or ACFs, we wouldn't pick that out. But because you've done that whole trajectory, we've now seen where the starting problem is, which is just amazing. And as you say, to follow that up then with well, why is this happening? Why do people feel they can't apply for these posts at those different levels? But if we were to talk about then even driving small kind of improvements with the data that you have now and with what you've done so far, is there anything small that you think we could now start to do? Because qualitative work takes time, and it will take time to seep through to really understand those barriers. But if we were to start thinking as a sideline of those small kind of improvements and tests of change that we could do, would there be one that you would suggest that as a community we could start with?
I mean, I think complex. I think so. Certainly, the motivation to this work and the thoughts of this work were around when I was applying to the SFP, and lots of broader changes around selection to the SFP. And I still don't quite think we've had a proper conversation nationally around what the SFP and academic training opportunities are actually for, because certainly the structure where it is up in Newcastle is completely different elsewhere, and the expected learning out of those things is different. And I think actually the first kind of small but relatively simple question might be actually, what is our aim here, guys? Like, what I suppose from kind of a director standpoint is what do you want out of people doing an SFP? I think in some ways actually this data is reassuring, because looking at the selection methods of the people who apply and then actually get the posts, that is fairly reassuring from a kind of what groups do and don't get these posts. So I think it's kind of we don't need to kind of panic or rush in or change loads around those points, particularly around things like the ACF. But I think the first, again, this might not necessarily be a small question, I hope I am answering your question, is what actually you know, what do we want out of this? Like, why do we have these posts and what are they used for? To then build on a, well, okay, how do we advertise that out more broadly, and how do we make sure that people feel able to do them? Does that actually answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again, putting your work, you know, is a particularly niche context, obviously in a UK context as well, that doesn't necessarily translate internationally. And I think that's I think for me, that's the bigger question is, so what are we aiming towards here? And as you say, it's quite reassuring that you see the trajectory that these intercalated degrees, which are quite unique actually, because we don't have them here in Ireland, you know, the opportunity that affords to people to be able to do that, and looking then at the trajectory of the opportunities that they have afterwards is quite reassuring, to be fair. So actually on a bigger scale, as an international scale, you can see that these intercalated degrees are having that level of impact, which is huge. So I think you're right. I think it's really understanding then, well, what's the ultimate aim here? And if everyone can work towards that, as you say, the design pieces might come with that as well. So huge thanks, Robbie. That was great work.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hayley. Hashim?
Thank you very much. I want really to start first by congratulating Robbie for the fantastic work. Really, really very excellent, very thorough study. It's a question really about your final comment about the respondent answering the questionnaire in unexpected, or what you perceive it is wrong. I mean, this I have really, you know, kind of had first-hand experience with that. So despite really, you know, having my supervisor to see the research questions, going through the piloting, all of that, when it came the data, actually a significant number answered the few questions in unexpected or a wrong way. And the problem is it is anonymized data, so I couldn't really, like yourself, you went back to your patient. I couldn't really go back to them. So how would you solve this problem in the least damaging way, to say?
Oh, I like that, least damaging sense. So I suppose potentially not answering your problem from a how do we fix the survey now. I think my learning is just you have to involve people from the start. So doing it from either a co-design or co-production lens is just the only way to do this in a valid sense. And certainly, you know, if you don't do that, you run the risk of having problems. So getting patients to actually, or people who are going to answer the survey, to look at that survey before you send it. Again, that can be simple. That can be a pilot, or it can be doing it properly, sitting down with someone in kind of a co-design or co-production sense to actually produce these data. Without knowing too much about your survey on your project, I think the only way I've previously been able to fix data like this is I've actually been able to get the contact data, because all the people that I put on to these surveys had agreed to then be contacted in future for things like semi-structured interviews and focus groups. I've actually recontacted people and spoken about their survey responses, talk about what they mean, so to actually make that then into a productive sense. But again, that was feasible within my research setting. And my question, I don't know if that's amazingly helpful for yours, but I think for everyone in the room, the most important thing is just making sure you have, for survey data or any sort of data where you're asking someone a question, get people in the room first before you send that survey out, because otherwise you run the risk of getting it wrong. Does that make sense / answer your question at all? Perfect.
Cool. I know it's a biggish group to ask questions, but we're all friends here. Or you may never see anyone else here ever again in your life. So it's a relatively safe place to ask a question if anyone has anything else they want to ask.
I think there's a question in the chat from Amy around some more examples of important questions in medical education. I suppose there's questions that I find important. There's questions that everyone else finds important, and they may not necessarily overlap. But I think the most important in very much hyphenated points questions to me are we going to have a workforce in 25 years in the NHS that's going to serve our people, serve our populations? Because we might not. And certainly there was a really nice paper done, again, with UK Med Data, where they actually did the whole paper in Excel, where they looked at the fact that we're probably going to be something like 20,000 physicians short in the UK by 2045. That's a bit worrying, isn't it? So I think questions around workforce and how do we maintain our workforce and how do we plan our workforce are important to me, and also make sure these opportunities are available to people are probably the most important ones to me. Hugh, Eileen, etc. may have some other better ideas than me, but that's probably my first hit.
It's definitely not a better idea, but I will just show you my one, I guess, published quantitative work, which I'll just because I'm proud of the graph. There you go. There you go. That's a good quantitative graph, isn't it? With some correlation figures. So I think in my career, probably the most significant paper we published was looking. So my background is general practice. And so we were looking at the correlation between how much time undergraduates spend in general practice compared to the proportion of graduates from that medical school that end up being GPs. And it showed there was a correlation. As you can see, it's not a very steep correlation. The statisticians told us it accounted for about 15% of the differences across medical schools, but it was associated. And I think on the back of that, this was getting on for 10 years ago, many medical schools have, maybe they were going to do that anyway. I certainly wouldn't claim that we've changed the whole of medical education through this one paper, but I think it was confirming or giving further ammunition for GP departments who wanted more time in undergraduate courses. So I'll stop showing off my one quantitative, and that's me as a qualitative researcher. But that was yeah, and again, yes, qualitative work would help to explore students' perceptions, and we've done masses of that. But actually, to show that there was a link, I think was quite helpful. Otherwise, it's harder, isn't it? I would say in education research. Often I have a group of second years who are just trying out some bits of research, and they all come up with, questions like, if we taught more of this, then students would know more about this, and let's do some randomized controlled trials to show it, etc. And it slowly dawns upon them that actually that's quite tricky to do. You need large numbers. Then it's an association, not and a link, not necessary proof. So it's really helpful, but can be tricky. Aileen, did you want to add to that at all?
No, thanks, Steve. Again, as a card-carrying qualitative researcher, I have to say I really love this work that really illuminates where there's a problem. So I think sometimes we look at, sort of a quantitative and qualitative divide as researchers can't cross that line. But actually, this is a really solid example of why and how we need both if we're to inform improvement. And I think, like you, Hugh, as my career has developed, and as much as I love the messiness and the grayness of qualitative research, I also love that research that has impact in many different ways. And one of the things I'm really interested in is that idea of quality improvement. And we really have to understand those data to identify where a problem is, to then understand the context and the causes of that problem if we're going to improve things in a bigger sense as well. So for me, it's not an either or. This is a really, really fab example of why you need all of it.
Absolutely. Yeah, good question, Amy. Hashim, I like your question. You're asking about a session on Delphi Studies data analysis. Probably coincidence because it's not new, but actually I'm quite interested in that as well, because first time ever I've been involved in 2 Delphi studies in the last year or so. What I'll do is I'll pass that back to the incubator working group, probably for a whole session. It would probably be more relevant at kind of not the Getting Started series. Having said that, as if by magic, it's so cool that you mentioned that, because I'm going to show this slide for the next session, which is on the 19th of March, and it's looking at qualitative data analysis with Mike Harrison. I always feel bad because my picture's up there for my 5-minute intro, and that's about all I do. But Mike is actually one of the collaborators I'm working with who's actually currently doing or completing a Delphi study. So what I can actually easily do is just ask Mike to add in a slide in his session next month. So it won't be details on Delphi study techniques, but I'll ask him to mention them in passing. But as I said, we'll also pass it back to the main working group to see if we can do a session at another time. Whilst I'm on this slide, this is the QR code for the next session and the website where I'm sure people have been on, because I think you need to be able to register. But also I've popped on there the misspelt email address So I think Newcastle normally has an A in it, and I think it will do on this email address as well. So for feedback and certificates, feel free to look at that. Thanks, Hashim. That was a very nice question to be able to answer. And yeah, thanks, Robbie. I was actually going to ask and then realised I couldn't volunteer you because you hadn't offered before. But do you want to mention that people can contact you since you put your email address up in the chat box?
Feel free.
Yeah, so I was going to say, if that's all right, then if people have questions, and Robbie can answer and or steer you in the right direction. So thanks again, everyone, for your time. Really appreciate it with your being busy. I hope that's given you a little bit of a taster and an interest in doing some quantitative work. And for those of you who want a bit more stuff on qualitative work, that'll be next month. And as I said, the video won't be straight up, but actually you can probably look at previous years if you're desperate to hear a bit more before this one is up. But it'll be up on the website in the next week or two with the slides and the recording. Look forward to seeing you at the next session, and do have a look on the website for other things going on with the incubator. So